Okay, so last but one class, and I think there are a bunch of things that are due. In particular, end of today, you will have to have your class reflections, and so that we can then sort of analyze them. And right on the queue, we have probably one of the nicest, deepest, mind-bending ideas that we will be talking about today, and that is Bayesian learning. Okay. So before I go forward, are there any questions? Okay. So we are going to basically we look at learning again, except this time from a Bayesian statistical learning point of view. Last time around, we looked at learning as a loss function minimization, optimization, etc. And one of the crazy things we try to explain to you is from a Bayesian perspective, which is sort of considered the first principles idea of learning. There is no difference between learning and reasoning. Okay, that's the mind-blowing thing. Except it turns out, remember what I said about Bayesians? When the Bayesians come to a fork, they say take. Okay, the fork is the set of hypotheses that can explain the data. Normal learners will try to see which of these hypotheses best explains the data in different ways. For example, they might write different kinds of loss functions and try to optimize that loss function, which is the reason why people tend to think of learning as optimization. But actually, from a first principles perspective, learning is just reasoning. You are reasoning over all the hypotheses, and in fact, one of the interesting things you do is you start thinking of hypothesis itself as a random variable. And it can take many different values. So if you have 15 hypotheses, that means this is a hypothesis, it's a 15 valued variable. And you have a prior on the hypothesis. And whenever you see a data point and it's labeled, let's say, you get to update the prior to compute the posterior using Bayes rule. Okay? And so as the examples pass through, you get a nice posterior distribution over hypothesis. Computation of posterior is just inference. There's no learning. Okay? And then how do Bayesians use these hypotheses? They will essentially say that all these hypotheses are possible with different likelihoods. And then each of them get to have a vote on the test point. For a test guy, let's say, you will say hypothesis 1 says this guy will pass the class. But it has only probability 0.1. Hypothesis 2 says he'll fail the class. But it has a probability 0.3, let's say. So you take the weighted summed value of the prediction. Actually, what you'll do is you'll compute the distribution of the label itself, given the distribution of hypotheses. You're completely awake and heard everything I said. You basically got first 1/3 or more of the class. I'll just try to walk you through them with examples. But the most important thing to understand really is this is a beautiful unifying class, because until here you kept thinking learning is different, reasoning is different. It's the same. Okay? The reason you decide to do learning to be optimization is because you don't know how to do that real Bayesian learning, which is actually the hard way of doing learning, but it's the best way of doing it. Which also tells you that all the great ideas in machine learning, such as dropout, such as random forest, somebody said, can you please talk about random forest? They are all essentially going from the maximum likelihood approximation of Bayes learning towards Bayes learning. I mentioned this at the time of dropout. So Bayesian learning is, nobody actually does it because it's too hard currently. but it gives you the basis for understanding it. It gives you the semantics for understanding it. It explains to you all this nonsense about what is overfitting, what is regularization, where all this stuff coming from. Okay? After that, you can then go back to your plug and check. You can say, I shall compute, I shall basically find the minimum of some loss function, etc. But this knowledge, once you get it, once you let it sink in, allows you to understand where the ideas come from. This is what I'm saying. But for our small brain, we would be doing Bayesian learning. And but for our computer small brains, they would also be doing Bayesian learning. In fact, when you talk about whether or not a particular learning problem is tractable, they talk about Bayes rate. That is, how well would a Bayesian classifier do on it, which you can't actually compute, which you can't actually train easily enough. There's no question of training, which you can't do the inference. But what will it do? And everything else will be a pale shadow. Is that intriguing enough? That's what we'll do today. And then from there, once we do that, we'll then go into learning Bayes networks, which is plug and chug, but not using Bayesian learning, but using maximum likelihood estimation. The word Bayes is overused in this class, but you have to remember which Bayes is what. Okay? Bayes rule, you all know. Okay? Bayes nets, it's a particular way of representing factored probability distributions. Bayes learning, one of the greatest ideas that really you should have understood before itself, that there is no such thing as learning. You don't have to learn anything, you don't ever have to commit. This business of serial monogamy is made up. You take all your partners at different levels of probability. My wife won't like it, but that's Bayes argument. You see what I'm saying? It's also intractable for people. Okay, but that's basically what Bayes learning is saying. By the way, the other very interesting point with respect to this is there, if you go to a statistics department, at least in the old days, there used to be religious wars between Bayesians versus frequentists. How many of you have heard Bayesian versus frequentist? What is the difference? This is the difference. Bayesians think hypothesis is a random variable, just like every other variable. Okay? So, Bayesians are like Bianchi. They will put a prior on everything. Like Bianchi will put ring on everything. Okay? So, Bayesians basically will put a prior on the hypothesis too. And then they can compute the posterior on hypothesis. But that basically means they are considering hypothesis to be a random variable. Frequentist statistics developed in a different way. They assumed hypotheses are not part of the same world as the other random variables. So in particular, Bayesians are happy to write this PH given D or PD given H. H given D is hypothesis given the data. Distribution of the hypothesis given the data. Or distribution of data given the hypothesis. They are happy to write this. Frequentists will have conniption fits. Because you cannot put an H on either side of the given. So instead what they will say is they will write P, D, colon, H. Anything like it makes all the difference. They can go to sleep happily, thinking they didn't do some sort of miscegenation of random variables and hypotheses. For the longest time, frequentists basically ruled the waves in statistics departments. And the Bayesians will be in some small corner. Now in that same corner, you will find the frequentists. Bayesians are in a slightly bigger corner. And then there's a deep learning corner also inside the statistics department. That's the whole hall. Okay, but that's the point. Okay, try to understand these jokes. You know, if after the class at least, if you don't understand them, you didn't understand what I'm trying to say. Most of these great jokes about Bayesianism, it's like there's, how many of you have heard, I may have mentioned this, how many of you have heard the Reduced Shakespeare Company? It's a great thing, which basically makes parody of all the Shakespearean plays. And it says, the better you know the original, the funnier this gets. That's the same thing. Okay? The better you know what Bayes learning is, all of this makes sense. Okay, from our perspective, essentially, neural networks do maximum likelihood learning, which is just a second level approximation of Bayesian. Okay? Now, before going forward, how many of you have seen Silicon Valley? See, you can tell your mom when you're watching Silicon Valley, Mom, I'm preparing for my AI exam. You see what I'm saying? So, F gradient descent, I don't need to use Guilfoyle's AI in order to improve middle-out. I need to use middle-out to create a new AI, a symbolic AI that it's now teaching itself. So tell me when you get to have this kind of a crossover between your database class or your software engineering class or whatever the heck other class you're taking and your TV life. Then you know how crazy AI right now is. Okay? Anyway. So, how do we learn Bayes nets is basically where we are getting started from. That's like the simple idea. So basically, we had Bayes nets that we were talking about giving manually specifying Bayes nets. Okay, and then when you're specifying Bayes nets, you have to specify topology, you have to specify conditional probability tables. Okay, one idea is either, you could either start, given topology, can I learn the conditional probability tables? Or given nothing, can I learn both topology and conditional probability tables? Both of those are essentially learning Bayes networks. The second one, learning both topology and CPTs, is obviously the more interesting aspect. And in fact, when you get to, I don't know how much time we'll have, when we get to actually learning topology of Bayes networks, it becomes very clear that maximum likelihood learning is for the birds. It doesn't work. Okay? You really have to consider Bayes learning ideas back in. Otherwise, you can't learn topology correctly. Okay? Just keep that in the back of your mind. So anyway, so you're going to learn Bayes nets. So basically, you want to learn them from the data, and you want to use to predict the other data. So you can look at the data, predict the other data. In between, you have hypothesis. The hypothesis happens to be represented, in our case, as Bayes nets, which is a probability distribution. Okay, Bayes nets are basically a compact form of probability distribution. So the basic idea that you all probably, if you have heard about this at all, those of you who heard about this, you would sort of do this in some sense of loss optimization. Instead of loss minimization, you do likelihood maximization. For those of you who know something about it. If you don't, that's fine. You'll learn about that particular thing. But what I've tried to do essentially is this really is a really poor man's version, or poor brain's version of Bayesian idea. If you have a big brain, you do Bayesian learning. Then you won't have any of, you don't need a chapter on overfitting. You don't need a chapter on regularization. All of that stuff doesn't happen. You see what I'm saying? It happens because you approximated Bayes learning. Okay, so imagine how much I'm building a Bayes learning. It has only down to go now. Because at this point of time, you think of this as like the greatest idea that you may have heard of, but that's probably true. But here's a couple of small things before we go forward, which is, first of all, we want to remember some things that we are trying to learn from a statistical learning perspective, we learn distributions. Okay? So imagine you have, xi's and yi's, and then you basically are trying to learn the joint distribution of xi's and yi's. In a classification sense, you typically want to predict y given x. Okay? Predict y given x. But sometimes, so basically sometimes you're most interested in just this part, predicting y given x. But this can be done if you have this. If you have the joint, you can predict. But if you just have this, you don't have the joint. Do you see what I'm saying? So there are two things you can do in learning. One is you can directly learn the joint, or you can learn the conditional. Okay? And you can actually see that these are connected. This is nothing but P, y1, etc., yn, given x1, etc., xn, times P, x1, etc., xn. Right? So the thing that this guy has, that this guy doesn't have, is this part. So what it's not capturing is the relation between the input variables. If you learn conditional distributions, if all you have to do is solve the problem of given x, tell me y, this is a cheaper thing to learn. And yet, you may be able to do classification without being able to generating the data. So for example, many of you can hear a song and say, yeah, that's a good, nice sounding song. This is a bad song. But most of us are extremely bad at generating songs, especially except in bathrooms, where somehow apparently all of us sound extremely good. Okay? So the point basically is, you may be able to discriminate between songs without having the ability to generate songs. Taylor Swift, I would assume, can at least discriminate between pop songs because she actually writes pop songs. So generation will give you discrimination, but discrimination doesn't necessarily give you generation. So there are like two kinds of learning that people wind up focusing on, either discriminative learning or generative learning. And those are essentially joint distribution versus conditional distribution. What do neural networks learn? Conditional distribution, y given x. Which is why if you clamp something at the output, input doesn't nicely arrange itself. Like for example, if I have generated a particular neural network to predict your grade for a student, then I say I want an A, can you make me a student who will get an A? It doesn't know. Do you see what I'm saying? And so that's the generative model, to be able to actually, given y, get the x. Given x, get the y. Given some of the x, some of the y, get the rest of the x, rest of the y. All of those can be done if you learn the joint distribution. The point, of course, is by learning this, you actually wind up learning less number of parameters, less amount of information. And so it's actually, most people will go with discriminative learning when they really should be doing generative learning and will complain saying, sorry, things aren't working. So there are like two different ways people keep on complaining. One is they should be doing Bayesian learning, they don't know how to do it, so they complain when the maximal likelihood doesn't work. The other is they should be doing generative modeling, instead they do discriminative modeling, and it won't work, and they complain saying learning isn't working. And the reason you don't do something is because those are hard to do, computationally hard to do. But it's important to know that that's the right thing to do. Okay? Okay, so that's about this discriminative versus generative models, and this is again represented here in this slide. By the way, slides are online. I actually put it up so you can look it up. Again, this makes this point that just because you are, excuse me, pull down guys, pull down, unless you want to have a small separate lecture here. Basically, if you are able to classify, that doesn't mean that you can generate. But generative models can do both. Okay? And so all you need for generation is joint models. That's it. Computing the joint distribution. That's it. Okay? And notice that Bayes networks can represent either joint distributions or conditional distributions. They can represent anything you want. Okay? Okay, by the way, this I actually like, I don't know how many of you have seen, in Simpsons, there's this one time, there's this episode about no child left behind policy. So everybody must, pass the exam. Now, passing the exam means the hard way is this. Show up every class and listen and people are droning on. The easy way is the exam is testing something. Just learn how to pass the exam. So this is this beautiful thing. She says the test sets that ETS makes come in these 8 patterns apparently. Aka aka, daba aka, aka aka. And so all the kids will be saying aka aka, daba aka. That's discriminative learning. These people, when they are flying your planes, Lord help you. You see what I'm saying? They know they have a 4.0 GPA by this. Okay? You guys want easy exams, you don't want the true-false questions with justifications. That's the stuff that requires, anybody can say true and false. It's 50% off, as we did. You know, but giving justification is generative theory. Which is why I have a lot higher respect for people who can write good justifications. Because that means they understand something. Okay? Not that you can't live life without being generative. That's what we are seeing too. Neural networks are mostly discrete. Okay. Now finally to the learning. Okay. So here is a very simple learning problem. Okay. I have a coin. Okay. And this coin basically comes heads or tails, and it's just a single variable. And I'm telling you upfront that the coin I have, I picked it up in Taiwan. It comes either heads 25% of the time or 50% of the time. You don't know which coin I have. I have one coin which comes heads only 20% of the time and comes tails 74% of the time. And the other coin which comes the normal boring coin which comes 50% heads, 50% tails. I basically pick up this coin. I have two coins, I pick up one. And I start tossing in front of you. You need to tell me which coin did I pick up. That's learning. Right? So you need to tell me which coin did I pick up and start tossing. And in particular, you're doing this really is if you're just interested in the learning part, you will just basically have to tell me which coin I picked up. But the real question is, I want you to be able to predict the next coin outcome. Okay? And so if you have learned the hypothesis, you can predict the outcome. You guys got that? Okay? So how would we go about doing this? Okay? So here are I did some tossing, and this is how it's coming. Heads, tails, tails, heads, tails, heads, tails, 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 tails. That's what happened. Now tell me, which is the coin that most likely have produced this outcome? What? Basically, your general idea would be to think in terms of data likelihood. You think of the hypothesis that would have produced this data with higher probability and say that's the hypothesis that actually was there. Right? This is the maximum likelihood idea. Right? So essentially what you are basically going to do is you compute with respect to this data the likelihood of this data given this hypothesis. How much is that? Heads is 0.25 times tails 0.75 times 0.75 times 0.25 times 0.75 blah blah blah. That multiplication number would be a really small floating point number, which by the way is another reason people take logs of probabilities. Because after you multiply huge number of less than 1 numbers, you will start getting underflow errors. And so you take log of probabilities, and since basically in general if you're trying to optimize something, maximizing the log of that is the same. Because log is a monotonic function. Okay, fine. So this is one idea, and the other one, this one says 0.5 times 0.5. What you really have to do is compute these numbers. Basically use your calculator, compute these numbers. And say whichever number is higher, that's the hypothesis that must have produced the data. That's the more likely. That's where maximum likelihood comes from. You're essentially picking the hypothesis that would have generated the hypothesis with higher likelihood. Everybody happy? Amazing way of doing learning? Yes?
But what if you don't have a single head?
What do you mean? This is one simple example. It doesn't really matter. Most of the interesting issues don't depend on how many coins you have. They do depend upon the next thing that I'm going to tell you. Which is, since you are so drunk with this, it looks like you know how to maximize the likelihood. In the case of discrete set of these, so here's the question. Where does the calculus come in? Well, I kind of cheated and said the coin is only one of two kinds. Either it comes 0.25 heads or 0.5 heads. But really I could have infinite variety of coins where the probability that a theta coin has the probability of coming heads as theta. And theta is a continuous variable between 0 and 1. So I wind up having this infinite number of probabilities, and I need to compute the likelihood for the data for each of these theta values and find the maximum. The only way you know how to do it is to take the derivative and make it equal to 0, which is where your calculus comes. Last time around you did minimization with loss function. Now you do maximization with likelihood function. But to understand the points, I'm just going with a discrete idea. That is, I just have two hypotheses, which hypothesis is better. If I understand that, I can do 8 hypotheses, I can do infinite number of hypotheses. Infinite is nothing but dealing with integration and differentiation. Okay, that's good, right? So, this looks like a foolproof way of doing things, right? Pretty foolproof. Now, I decided to just, in the same coins, again I only have one of these two coins, and I picked this coin from my pocket this time, and I did toss 3 times. And it came heads once, tails twice. What do you think is the most likely coin? No, do you think this data has been produced by the blue or the green? What?
Green?
Blue pill or red pill? I should have made blue pill. Okay, blue or green? Most obviously the maximization will tell you the green one, because heads are coming with lower probability. Now here is my simple question to you. I have done this twice. The first time around you basically kind of agreed green is the right answer. Even though maybe probabilistically speaking the blue just is having a good streak. Okay, but green is the right answer. Right? But this time, again I'm asking you to believe whichever is the higher likelihood is the right answer. Which one are you more comfortable in? Which of the two scenarios are you more comfortable going with the likelihood? First one. Why don't you want to do this in the second one? It's the same data. There's not enough data. What is this nonsense about enough data? Enough for what? What? I understand, I mean, why? So what is the formal way of saying enough versus not enough? We make up this nonsense about there's enough data. Okay? The real idea is the idea was bad to begin with. It's just that it becomes obvious that it's a bad idea here. Here, it's pushed under the rug. You understand what I'm saying? What you guys should have done is, having seen the data, you should have computed the posterior probabilities of both these coins. And given the posterior probabilities, that's all you will say. I still won't jump to the conclusion that it's either green or blue. I'll say it's green with this much probability, blue with this much probability. Why did you jump to the conclusions? I just said a person was walking. Ask yourself how many of you have jumped to thought of a man, woman, person walking versus you either thought of a man walking or a woman walking. All of you who either thought of man walking, woman walking are humanly free. That's where sexism comes from. Because we don't know how to do disjunction in our heads. This non-sexist writing which says right there, that's what I said a person. But all the men are thinking a person wearing, man clothes. And some of the women are thinking a person wearing women's clothes. Some other people are sleeping. You understand what I'm saying? We jump to the conclusions for no good reason. If you don't jump to the conclusions, you can't be wrong. That's the notion of Bayesian learning, which also means that Bayesian learning is a oxymoron. You never jump to the conclusion. You say, I'll keep everybody around with different probabilities. Okay? So, let me show that to you more. Is this clear to people? Okay, let's go. So, the idea, the reason in some sense this is happening to you in the low quality field is that most of you don't believe that coins, if you randomly pick a coin, it will be so bad that it will be a 0.25 heads coin. So if I didn't tell you that if I say I have a coin in my pocket, you will assume the prior probability that the coin is fair is extremely high. The prior probability that the coin is not fair is lower. That means the probability distribution peaks at 0.5. This means you have additional knowledge about how the world works, which is why you are uncomfortable going and saying, in this case, that green is the good hypothesis. Whereas in the previous case you thought, well, I started with assuming that people are not cheating, but then they cheated 18 times, then I have to change my mind. Do you understand what I'm saying? So that's basically what is going on with prior probability to posterior probability. You see the evidence and you change your probability. If you do this, the hypothesis became a random variable now. It's not some other magical guy. Hypothesis is in the same land as the problem variables. Hypothesis H is in the same land as the problem variables. Okay, let me show you another more interesting example. This is from actually the textbook. Russell is into these candy bags. So basically there are cherry candies and lime candies, and you're making bags by basically each bag has basically the same number of candies but in different percentages. And the bags come essentially, sort of in plain paper, brown paper, it's like contraband. So you have to pick a bag. You've seen this, right? Pick a bag, some random bag, and then if you're lucky, you'll get something good from it, otherwise you won't. Okay. So in this particular case, you're going to be seeing a whole bunch of these kinds of bags, and you have to pick one, and then you have to be able to predict what was the percentage, what was the original percentage of lime versus cherry candies in this bag. Do you see what I'm saying? Now, if I didn't tell you anything, you can just take the bag and keep looking at the candies and then eventually say, well, after seeing all the candies, I know what percentage are lime and what percentage are cherries. The question is, how quickly can you get to that? So, I'll tell you, just like in the case of